My name is Laura Burns, and I'm a member of the OPA Education Committee. The Ohio Psychological Association's Education Committee would like to welcome you to Interdisciplinary Research Approach, Studying the Effectiveness of Yoga and Mindfulness with Juvenile Offenders, a virtual workshop presented as part of our 2021 annual convention. OPA is an approved CE sponsor of the American Psychological Association and maintains responsibility for the program and its content. OPA is also an approved CE provider of the Counselor, Social Worker, and Marriage and Family Therapist Board of Ohio. This session has been approved for 2 continuing education credits. Instructions on how to receive CE credit will be covered at the end of this workshop and are available at our website at www.ohpsych.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Lynn Williams is a licensed psychologist with the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Court, providing court-ordered forensic mental health assessments to youth offenders and adults from the Department of Children and Family Services. She previously worked for 10 years at the Ohio Department of Youth Services, delivering holistic interventions to incarcerated youth and their families. She has joined the Prison Yoga Project to develop a program specific to the needs of juvenile offenders. Her article, The Value of Alternative Therapies in Mental Health Treatment for Incarcerated Youths, was published in Corrections Today. She lectures extensively on mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency. Dr. Liz Goncy is an associate professor of clinical psychology at Cleveland State University. Her program of research focuses on the importance of relationships on adolescent and young adulthood outcomes, specifically intimate aggression, violence, victimization, and other problem behaviors. She specifically focuses on the etiology of these problems, identification of related risk and protective factors, and resulting mental health consequences. She also has expertise in psychometric evaluation, person-centered and variable-centered approaches to measurement, and evaluation of prevention and intervention programming. Dr. Katherine Kelton is an intern at the Durham VA Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina, and a doctoral candidate in the clinical psychology and Master of Science in Public Health dual degree program at St. Louis University. Her program of research has been heavily informed by her clinical experiences and follows the common thread of the intersections of multiculturalism, trauma, marginalized groups, and system issues. Specifically, she is interested in the ways trauma disrupts the mind-body connection, as well as how potentially traumatic events can play a role in the pathway to involvement in the criminal legal system. To this end, she is interested in post-traumatic stress symptoms as a target of intervention for reentry. Additionally, she is interested in how treatments are developed and evaluated for underserved groups and how programs are sustained in spaces with few resources. Now it's my pleasure to turn over the workshop to our speakers. Welcome.
The interdisciplinary research approach, studying the effectiveness of yoga and mindfulness with juvenile offenders. It's my pleasure to do this workshop. We actually planned it for last OPA conference, but due to the virus, we were unable to finish it. So we're really grateful for this opportunity. I'm Dr. Lynn Williams, psychologist. I currently work with the Cuyahoga County Juvenile Court, but I formerly worked for 10 years with the Ohio Department of Youth Services. And I have some wonderful people with me today that shared in this wonderful project. Dr. Goncy, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Liz Goncy. I'm an assistant professor at Cleveland State University and a clinical psychologist. I'm representing today part of the Thrive Research Collaborative, which has done the research component and evaluation as part of the Prison Yoga Project in this approach that we're going to share with you all today.
And Dr. Kelton, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. My name is Katherine, and I am currently finishing my predoctoral internship at the Durham VA. What I'll be presenting on today is just some theory behind yoga as a tool for self-regulation. And I'll be sharing some components of my dissertation. And I've also collaborated with Lynn and Liz on the juvenile offender side of things.
And Dr. Van Heijs.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Van Heijs. I was a longtime art teacher in the Cleveland schools, and then when I retired, I got certified to teach yoga. And honestly, throughout my career, I always had in the back of my mind that I would end up teaching somehow in a prison, although I thought it would be teaching art. And then when I was working on my certification in yoga, the opportunity came up to teach at Cuyahoga Hills. And at first, I was a little unsure about doing this, but not because I was afraid or anything, but just because there were things going on in my personal life. And so I jumped in. I mean, Lynn really encouraged me to start there. And so I taught for about 3 years at Cuyahoga Hills every week until COVID hit. And then of course, no volunteers were allowed anymore. So, but anyway, it has been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. So this is a collaboration with the Ohio Department of Youth Services, Cleveland State University, and the Thrive Research Collective, which is a collaboration of different departments at Cleveland State, which Dr. Goncy will talk about later. So we're going to actually start off the workshop. I don't know if you've been doing a lot of online webinars or not, but consider this kind of an experiential about what yoga is, because we can talk about yoga but and meditation, but to actually experience it can give you a nice template for what we'll be talking about. So Chris, I'll let you, I'm going to actually mute myself, and then Chris, I'll let you do this.
Okay.
Well, actually, what I'll do first, I'm sorry, is we'll do the assessing your stress. So if you can take a minute and just find your resting heart rate. So that can be taking a neck pulse or your wrist. And I'm going to count 10 seconds and just record that number. Ready, set, go. Stop. So you're going to multiply that number by 6, and you're just going to set that aside. And I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead. I'm going to mute myself.
All right. So during the yoga program, we mostly did about 20 or 30 minutes of yoga, and then closed it with 10 or 15 or whatever time we had for relaxation. So I want to start, first of all, maybe take a breath in. If you're comfortable, close your eyes or find a gazing point. Taking a deep breath in, releasing it through your mouth, and another breath in, releasing through your mouth. And then I have a passage to read, and this is titled Walk Slowly. It only takes a reminder to breathe, a moment to be still. And just like that, something in me settles, softens, makes space for imperfection. The harsh voice of judgment drops to a whisper, and I remember again that life is not a relay race, that we will all cross the finish line, that waking up to life is what we were born for. As many times as I forget, catch myself charging forward without even knowing where I'm going. That many times I can make the choice to stop, to breathe and be, and walk slowly into the mystery. So once again, begin to focus on your breath. I invite you to place your hands on your belly and begin to go within, just following the path of your breath as you sit here, noticing what you notice. No need, if thoughts come into your mind, just let them float through like clouds float through the sky on a sunny day. And I'm going to start music right now. And just begin to follow your breath. Noticing where the breath comes into the belly. Maybe breathing into your hands on your belly. Softening the belly as you can. Now beginning to notice any points where you might be clutching or holding the breath. Beginning to notice maybe any points where you're carrying stress in the neck, maybe in the shoulders. I don't know about you, but I've been shoveling, so my shoulders are a little achy. So wherever you feel any kind of tension, just begin to send your awareness, your breath to that spot. And now I invite you to open your eyes. Maybe begin to inhale your shoulders up towards your ears. Relax them back down with the exhale. Inhaling up. Exhaling, release. And one more time, inhaling the shoulders up. Exhaling, release. Bring your hands as you're seated here to your knees, taking an in-breath. On the out-breath, begin to twist toward your bent knee, or if you're seated, just to one of your knees. And just breathe into this gentle twist. Breathing into the spine, noticing, sending the energy up and down the spine. Then inhaling back to center, taking a pause and exhaling. Inhaling again. And then twisting in the opposite direction to the opposite knee. And now breathing in and out in this gentle twist. No need to push into it too far. You're just warming up the spine. And then inhaling back to center, bringing your hands behind you on the chair, or maybe even on the back of the chair, or even dropping your hands to your side. Just leaning back slightly, opening the heart to the sky, and breathing into your open heart, dropping your head back if you're comfortable with that. You know, sitting at a computer, a lot of us are sitting at a computer for a good part of the day on Zoom or whatever. It helps to open up the spine and the heart in the opposite direction at these points, instead of hunching over the computer. And then inhaling back to center, finding yourself resting on your sit bones, maybe rocking from side to side, just like kids do sometimes to calm themselves down. Dropping one hand over to one side, inhaling the opposite hand up and over, breathing into this gentle curve. Once again, noticing any sensations you have on the side that you're curving, on the side you're stretching, breathing into those tensions or aches, possibly, or just noticing. And then inhaling back to center, both arms come up, stretching your hands to the sky. And then dropping the opposite hand down and inhaling the opposite arm up and over. Once again, breathing into that side. Notice that you're sitting on your sit bones, balanced on both sit bones, not leaning too much into that opposite side. And then inhaling back to center, both arms come up once again, planting your hands up to the sky, dropping your head back if you're comfortable with that, or keeping your chin level. And then once again, dropping your hands to the front of you, or if you're in a chair, just dropping your hands down and take a mini forward fold down, pushing into the back body, curving your back forward. Now, breathing into the back, noticing where your breath is moving in the back body. Then inhaling back to center, once again, dropping your hands back, opening your heart to the sky. And then inhaling back to center, once again, bringing your hands to your belly, breathing into your hands softly, trying once again to soften any points along your body, your back body, your shoulders, arms, wherever you might feel tension, breathing into that tension, breathing it out and letting go. Noticing your breath, softening the breath as you can, walking, breathing into that mystery that I read in that passage this morning. Closing your eyes if you're comfortable with that. Just following the path of your breath. Breathing in, stillness, breathing out, and letting go. Breathing in stillness, breathing out, letting go. Just being here with the breath. Breathing in stillness, breathing out, and letting go. And now gently blink open your eyes. Bring yourself back, your awareness back to the room where you are. Okay, Lynn. So just a few moments of breathing like that. I mean, especially the slow breath can help release cortisol through the system. Mostly the exhales help with that. So anytime you can focus on your exhales and extending those exhales can help you release any kind of tension that builds up in the body.
Thank you, Chris. So before we go to our next segment, I'm going to have you find your pulse again. So again, that's either in your neck or your wrist. And I'm going to count to 10. So once you find your pulse, ready, set, go. stop. So you're going to write that number down and multiply it by 6. These are some resting heart rates divided by gender and age. So you can kind of see where you might fall, and just noticing for yourself your resting heart rate before the practice until after the practice, if there were any changes. And it's just something to note. Oftentimes when I've taught this in person, people have reported lower resting heart rates. And so the reason we do this experiential is oftentimes when people hear the word yoga or meditation and they say, oh, you know, I have to be fit, or I have to have special clothes, or only benefits women. But we do this because we really want to show you that meditation is for everyone, allowing more relaxation and a relaxation response, increasing breathing, resetting the mind-body system is possible for everyone, even with disabilities, limited movement, young, old. It's accessible to everyone. This is just a small thing. It's from Harvard, just promoting how you can add mindfulness to your day. So as you can see, I don't know if you're at work, but like, you know, you don't need special clothes. You can do a guided meditation. You can do a body scan. You can check in with your breathing, and those are all possible at any time during the day. And sometimes people say, I don't have enough time, and you can actually incorporate it into your day. These are part of your handouts, which were sent to you. It's from the Cleveland Clinic, and they have a program, it's called Yoga on the Go. So you could be sitting, you can be standing. When I worked at the prison, actually the officers, a lot of their shifts are standing. So I shared with them these handouts so they could actually do some yoga while they were on their shift. These are just some brain images. So you can see before meditation and after, there's more activity. So part of our research is you know, just showing how this actually is incorporating some possible structural changes in the neurological system and the physical system to kind of help promote resilience in youth. And here's just another brainwave. So normal person. And so this is just someone even without any deficits, just a regular person. So actually you can enhance cognitive functioning, mental and emotional health as well. So when we think about introducing yoga and meditation with youth, so they have the teenage brain, which has a lot of things going on in it, developmentally, things are working out, hormones, and all these different things. So as we know, teenage time of adolescence is quite intense for teenagers. And actually, when we look at it, 1 in 5 children between the ages of 13 and 18 live with a mental health condition. So when we look at just those general statistics for a normal adolescent population, when we look at incarcerated youth, we have quite staggering statistics. So the 1 in 5, that is the 20%, the general mental health. So you can see in juvenile justice population, it jumps to 70% have some type of mental health condition. And when you break it down by conditions, on the right-hand side is the general adolescent population, 5 to 8% depression. With juvenile justice, it's 47%, anxiety 13%, juvenile justice 21%, ADHD 4%, juvenile justice 21%, and PTSD 5%. With 32% in the juvenile justice population. So here's those similar numbers again, the 70% that do have a diagnosed mental health disorder. And then we see that 25% of detention facilities have few or no mental health services. So you have these high rates of prevalence of conditions and not enough services to match that need. So in particular with the juvenile justice population, there's general at-risk areas for youth, but we find with the juvenile justice population that actually they have more than one of these. So supportive family, protection from others, a lot of the neighborhoods, there's high crime, physical health challenges. And with the virus, I know a lot of children that haven't been able to go to school, haven't been able to get meals because at lunchtime, and sometimes they have breakfasts at the schools, that would be their primary meals. Education, emotional health, social connectedness, drug, alcohol use. And when we look at trauma with confined youth, we see staggering numbers: 30% attempted suicide, 70% has seen someone severely injured or killed, 72% had something very bad or terrible happen to you. When I first worked at Cuyahoga Hills, it's a juvenile facility. It houses about 150 to 200 youth, ages, it could be 11 to up to 21 in the state of Ohio. Youth can be retained in the juvenile system up to age 21. So we'd have those numbers. And prior to that, I worked 10 years at a residential facility for adolescents, primarily with mental health issues. And when I went to the prison, some of the youth, they would say things like, this person died, I watched this person get shot in the head. There was so much violence. And at first it was hard to just believe, because it really, to me, was like almost like a movie, because how could this many people die so young? How could there be this much gun violence? How can, youth that are 17 already saw 3 people killed in front of them? But it's a sad reality, what these youth have had to witness. So when people are generally doing their intakes for mental health assessment, you're looking at some general areas of abuse. Have you been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused? You've had neglect? Have you had some household dysfunction, mental illness, incarcerated relatives, substance abuse, mother treated violently? So when we do assessments, we have a general trauma intake screen. And like I was saying, with urban youth, the exposure to violence is so staggering. 75% heard gunshots, 18% had seen dead bodies, 10% saw shooting or stabbing. So when we look at a broad definition of trauma, so it's not just maybe those core areas, but trauma is an emotional wounding resulting from a shocking event or multiple and repeated life-threatening and or extremely frightening experiences that may cause lasting negative effects on a person, disrupting the path of healthy physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual development. So now when we take a general definition of trauma and kind of broaden that, we see lots of trauma in a broader perspective. We see social and system demands as trauma. We see economic status as trauma. We see residential instability as trauma, social and public incivilities as trauma, daily hassles as trauma. And with kind of the political state of the world and Black Lives Matter and those kind of things, there's a lot of challenges to what is institutionalized racism, systemic racism, and looking at how racism is actually embedded as a normal practice within our society and organizations. So when we look at trauma, there's a concept called toxic stress. So looking at bias, trauma, and family hardship as additional stressors with this population. So when we have trauma in a broader perspective, you know, it can be 90% of juvenile justice involved youth, and you could even push maybe, you know, even higher, have had multiple traumas from an early age consistently. So I had started working at the prison at about 2010. So at that time, it was actually, I was really grateful because at that time, Ohio was reforming their juvenile justice services. They were hiring more behavioral health staff, which I was a part of. And they really gave me free rein to develop innovative programming that I felt was effective, and they let me implement it. And we had some federal monitors. They were very supportive of the yoga program. So it's been booming ever since. So that's 10 years. So it's just been growing and growing and growing. Oops, excuse me. So at that time, Ohio really was a national model. And we went to New Orleans and presented at the American Correctional Association conference. So when we are looking at yoga, meditation, and mindfulness, it isn't so, I say, out there, or isn't just for girls. It's actually, it could be a treatment for mental health disorder, but in any event, it does have positive benefits. So at the Cleveland Clinic, they've expanded, you know, their traditional practice. They have an integrative medicine center, and you can see this little one doing some yoga. So these are different types of mind-body therapies. Cognitive behavioral is one, and that's the most predominant one, but we have relaxation, breathing techniques, biofeedback, heart math, art, music, pet therapy, mindfulness meditation, imagery, visualization, yoga, tai chi, and hypnosis. And we see big companies not investing in mindfulness, Google, Target, General Mills, because this is from the Harvard Business Review. This is because they see the physical and the emotional benefits, and these companies see increased productivity, you know, more happiness in their employees. And so kind of it's a win-win for everybody. We saw meditation make the cover of Time magazine as a science. We've seen studies, meditation reduces emotional pain, stronger than the pain reductions in morphine. We see just yoga growing and growing. This actually is between 2002 and 2007. So that was quite a while ago. You have 13 million adults, and I have the updated statistics. Actually, 36 million Americans are practicing yoga, and that increased between 2012 and 2016, 50%. So, and there's estimated 300 million yoga practitioners worldwide. This is a picture. Every year, New York does, it's called a summer solstice. And I think this picture, 17,000 people attended in Times Square. There's an organization called Street Yoga. They're based out of Oregon. That's actually when I first started to see how yoga, they did it with homeless people in the street, and homeless youth. They didn't have mats, they didn't have special clothes, and it really worked. So that was my first experience with just yoga, just being accessible to everyone. And here's a nice picture there. They have some youth in the street. So actually, the U.S. Department of Education has endorsed mindfulness officially. They found that in schools that not only does it reduce stress, increases the capacity to learn, increases attention span, regulate emotions. And then you have all these different benefits of yoga and mindfulness. So I'd written an article, this is for Corrections Today in 2016, the value of alternative therapies in mental health treatment for incarcerated youth. This is when the program, I was just kind of doing it on my own. I just found it effective. I just kind of did my little thing and the youth loved it. And so I just kind of was in my little bubble. And then I actually went to Chicago. James Fox, who is the founder of Prison Yoga Project, was doing a training. He is based out of California and does prison yoga with the inmates on death row at San Quentin. And he's been doing it, I don't know, Katherine maybe knows the exact year, but like he's been doing it for a really long time. So when I saw his training in Chicago, I thought it was great, but even though it was, geared for adults, it was similar population. So actually when we linked up, he said, he was trying to, reach out to the juvenile population as well. So we just had a really nice collaboration ever since then. And so actually, Prison Yoga Project has opened a Ohio branch. This is the chapter director Rebecca Cervinek, who is our director in Ohio. So she leads both the adult and juvenile in Ohio. This is kind of a recent development. I think she's been in this position maybe a year. So you can see for 10 years, it's just kind of building and building and building. But it's been really wonderful to expand in this way. So when I started focusing with the juveniles, we made a Facebook page, Prison Yoga Project Northern Ohio juvenile program. Unfortunately, after the virus, we've had to suspend our in-person classes. So there aren't a lot of updates recently, but you can go in there and see some nice pictures. There's Chris with our youth. We actually were able to, so the program got so popular. So initially when I went there, we would just, anybody want to do yoga? And out of 150 kids, maybe 10 kids might come. And then when it grew with popularity, we actually had 30 mats at that time. So we did 2 classes with 30 kids. Luckily at that time, the violence in the institution, wasn't too high. So we were able to kind of mix a lot of kids in one place. Fortunately, things just became more restrictive with the different units. So we had to keep it smaller. But what we did was when the youth come to the facility, within the first 30 days, they're on what's called an intake unit to kind of get acclimated to the environment before they go to their home unit. So we were able to do yoga twice a week on the intake unit. So we ensured that every youth in the facility, had some exposure to yoga. And then after they left their home unit, we had a few ongoing classes. And we were lucky enough to get the school had some leeway with some additional classes. So we were able to get a school yoga class so the youth could actually earn high school credit by participating in the yoga class during their school day. I think right now too, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the actual grant that we received before we move on. So when I started at Cuyahoga Hills, I was just doing it myself. I am a certified yoga instructor. I did that because I wanted to teach. And it's hard to ask people to volunteer for nothing. And, at that time there was no budget. And I just kind of did it myself. And then my responsibilities, I was working there as a clinical psychologist, so I had other responsibilities, but my responsibilities were kind of a lot. And so luckily I was able to get some volunteers. We actually had about 5 volunteers, including Chris. And we were able to get a grant to buy all new mats, and we also did some, which we'll talk about later, restorative yoga. So there's different blankets and different things to kind of help the body relax. We were able to purchase some of that equipment with that grant. We received it not this past April, but the April before. And that was a year grant. And during that time, Cleveland State graciously offered to do some research. So we were actually able to get the research that you'll be seeing today actually is a result of part of that support from the grant. And Chris generously offered her time, but we were so grateful that we could compensate her. So that grant just ended last April. And then with the virus, obviously, we had to suspend in-person classes. And I'm going to talk a little later. We're trying to get some funding for DVDs. A lot of the detention centers have a great need and they're wanting to continue classes, but trying to do a Zoom and they don't have the audio visual stuff and they have to coordinate the staff is very difficult. But the facilities have said if we can get DVDs that they're willing to use them. So that's kind of our next thing that we're doing here. So just to show you the prevalence of how this is working, that there's a lot of research now that's being conducted with trauma-informed yoga. So when we talk about yoga, we're talking about mindful yoga, trauma-informed yoga, which Katherine's going to talk more about. And the Georgia State University actually received a $700,000 grant to research the effects of yoga, both on coping skills, but also reducing recidivism. So here's just another picture, juvenile detention centers using yoga to teach mindfulness. And we also see it in the child welfare system. I know Chris also has taught with Cuyahoga County's foster care system. So that's another population. There's a organization out of Atlanta. It's called Gangstas to Growing. To growers, Gangsta to Growers. So they actually have a holistic program. It's actually a work program. The students get paid. So they learn farming and sustainable practices, but they actually also do yoga every day as part of their practice. So when we do yoga with the youth, obviously at first there's some hesitation. They don't know what it is. They have concepts of what that is. So a lot of times with the urban youth and we're in Cleveland, Ohio. So just explaining to them that LeBron does do yoga as part of his workout is a good selling point. So yoga, and he talks about, and there's actually commercials. He is one of the representatives for the Calm app. There's different apps for mindfulness, but the Calm app, he talks about how you can train your mind with yoga, and it just isn't about physical fitness. And actually, when I work with the youth too, there's a YouTube video of LeBron. It's like in the Final Four, he's sitting on the sidelines, closing his eyes and taking some breaths. And I think the caption is LeBron meditating. So that's always nice. So this is, again, the Cleveland Clinic is sponsoring this picture of LeBron teaching the youth. I also tell the youth LeBron, and these other famous basketball players have taught yoga at the Nike basketball camps. So this is just a picture of LeBron. This is a video of LeBron. It's just a 30-second commercial.
We've always thought of great athletes as the strongest, the fittest, chiseled to perfection. But what's a strong body without a sound mind? We're so focused on strength that we forget to strengthen our focus. The mind is like a muscle. The more you train it, the stronger it becomes. And while the greats master the body, the greatest master the mind.
So you can see in that commercial, LeBron is just talking about how the emphasis on physical fitness isn't the goal, that training your mind is very important. So when I talk to youth, I talk about most of the times they have difficulty managing anger or managing depression or managing anxiety, and they have trouble sleeping. And so really helping them see how they can actually train their mind. I wanted to go over some general statistics from the state of Ohio. This was done in May 2020, just so you can kind of see some data related to youth incarceration. So I just want to say, with racial issues, Ohio has been shown to just disproportionately incarcerate Black youth. Actually, the trend has gotten better, but still there's a lot of work to be done. So you can see that 55% of youth in incarcerated juvenile facilities, that's a JCF, 55.6% are African American, and in the general population in Ohio, they're only comprised of 15%. Again, we want to look at kind of the trends. So it is going downward. In 2014, it was 61% to now, which is you're at 53%. And these are data from the Department of Youth Services, but there's still a long ways to go. This is just another slide. We have adjudications. These are youth that have been adjudicated, but maybe not committed to a facility, 48%, and then commitments, 59%. And this is from 2018. So this is from the Sentencing Project. That's a national organization. We see that African American youth are 5 times more likely to be held than whites. And in Cuyahoga County in 2018, we had 745 felony juvenile adjudications, 84% African American and 6% Caucasian. The reason I say those statistics as well is there's kind of a new area of focus with yoga. This is a book by Gail Parker. She's based, I think, out of California. Restorative Yoga for Ethnic and Race-Based Stress and Trauma. So when we talked about the beginning of the talk, talking about a broad lens of trauma, that yoga not only can target possible mental health issues, general stress, but also ethnic and race-based stress and trauma. So we're going to show another video. This is from the Urban Yogis. There's actually a series on YouTube. They're based out of New York. This is Jaquil. We won't be watching his story, but I often, for youth, play this story. Actually, Urban Yogis gave us permission to copy their videos. So when we're making our DVDs to go into the institutions, we'll be able to show that video, because a lot of times they don't have Wi-Fi access or things like that. So we're lucky that we can be affiliated with them. So the next video is just to talk about one woman's experience of doing yoga in the juvenile detention center. And then Chris is also going to talk as well. Oops.
Before I started practicing yoga, my body posture was like, you could tell I was upset and my mind was in nothing but negative thoughts.
My name is Eddie Stern. I'm a yoga instructor. Stretch the arm. If I see a place where yoga would be helpful and someone invites me to do something, I say yes. That's all there is to it.
My name is Leslie Booker, and for the past 7 years, I've been teaching yoga and meditation to at-risk populations. I started working with pregnant teenage girls, and then I moved over with Lineage Project, and I've been working with incarcerated youth ever since.
Horizon Detention Facility is a high security facility for youths under 18 years old who are awaiting sentencing or serving out sentences for a variety of crimes, ranging from truancy all the way up to murder.
During a presentation on gangs, they showed a newspaper clipping of one of the girls that I've been working with for probably 2 years at this point. And I knew her as this sweet little 15-year-old girl who had a baby at home and who, really loved yoga. As it turned out, she was accused of murdering 2 people in a really, really vicious way. And we forget how young they are. These are kids that are 13, 14, 15 years old. They're children.
I miss being with my family, with my brother, my sister, my mom.
I miss my family on the outside.
The hardest thing is that you don't got your freedoms. Like, you miss your family and you can be with them because you're locked up because of what things you do.
So the way that a lot of their stress and frustration manifest is just acting out, getting violent, screaming, cursing, starting fights with other kids. And they might know when they're being triggered, when they're going to react to someone, but they haven't developed those skills and what to do. So I think that what Lineage does is that we go inside, we work with young men and women to teach them skills that empower them to make better decisions in their life. The vehicle that we use is yoga and meditation. All right, dear ones, we're going to go and get started, please. So we have a special guest today. This is Eddie. And Eddie is a very well-known yoga teacher around New York City.
When we came into the room, you could see this is a glum group of kids. But these are young human beings who are going to be affected by relaxing and breathing and moving the same way a Wall Street banker is going to be affected. If we know we can give something to someone which is going to relieve their suffering and make them calm, even for an hour, then we should do it.
Before I started practicing yoga, my body posture was like, you could tell I was upset and my mind was in nothing but negative thoughts.
I feel different because, the bad things I got in my mind, it go away for a minute, and it feels good. After the yoga class, I'm feel more at peace.
And a lot of times it happens so organically that kids don't even realize that the practices actually really help them to stay out of trouble or to not get into that fight or not engage with another person.
This is a good program to take when you're angry or when you're stressed out. So you just stress.
They're happy for that 1 hour that they do the yoga. We know that. Maybe we do yoga for an hour a day and we feel calm and good, and then we go out there and it's just like an assault on the senses and on our nervous systems and on everything. Still, we know for that 1 hour, we need that 1 hour.
So think of the time when we were at our most happy. So maybe it was yesterday, maybe it's when we were small child. So working with at-risk youth, teaching yoga and meditation was never my intention. Never thought this is what I would be doing with my life. I was in the fashion industry before this. It becomes almost addictive to see like these little tiny things shift so quickly in these young people. You just want to come back over and over again and see what the next evolution of that is. Become more empowered. They find their inner strength. They start to make their own decisions. They become these young men and women instead of these children. And then to go back home and to share them with others, with their little brothers or sisters or their moms. It's really cool to hear these stories about how they are sharing it over the phone when they call or when there's a visit comes. So it's really great that the work is spreading out.
Well, when I get upset, take a deep breath in, deep breath out. No.
So we could just see how impactful the yoga is. And Chris and I, we could be here all day. We have, if not the same stories, very, very similar stories. How much benefit they receive and how they do want to share it with others and, you know, with their families. And that's really powerful. So, you know, oftentimes with youth, one of the kind of catch coping skills is stop, think, and act. So actually with yoga, it expands to stop, breathe, and act. And so what we're actually doing is, you know, we're having the youth stop and figure out, not just with their minds, but with their bodies, inducing a relaxation response, letting the go of the mind, body tension, the muscles, and then letting go of the mind. Wanted to share some pictures from our program. We had 48 youth. This is just one quarter, but we had 48 youth participate. We would do a quarterly retreat after the youth participated, and all the yoga teachers would come. We'd have live music. The different teachers would do portions of the retreat. And if you can see at the bottom right-hand corner, these are the equipment that was purchased with the grant. And we did restorative practices. So restorative yoga, there's kind of an active yoga with physical movement, and these are more relaxation, but the equipment helps the body relax even deeper. It supports the body and the muscles to relax even deeper. And we did use aromatherapy. And of course, we had ice cream at the end. That was always the fun ending to it. So actually, I was at DYS for 10 years, and there are so many different practices that the youth wanted to remember for when they got out and things. So I actually compiled a book that hopefully it'll be published late this year. Entitled Power of Peace Within Me, Mindful Yoga for You. So it incorporates a lot of the different practices that the youth found helpful, and actually we're collaborating with the Prison Yoga Project and a local organization in Cleveland called the Golden Ciphers to collaborate together to, it's a joint project to get this distributed as widely as possible. And as a companion to that, when I was mentioning the DVDs, when we did the program at Cuyahoga Hills, the youth made they said, we're Yoga Flame. They love that name of their group. So we actually made it into a model. So there's specific poses that help with different qualities or characteristics. So for example, we had a sequence solely on improving focus. So that would increase attention and concentration. Another special sequence on letting go, increasing relaxation, could help with trauma, anxiety. anger management, a sequence to decrease aggression, another one for mindfulness, increasing tolerance to stress, decreasing impulsivity, which could be related to addiction, substance abuse, and exhaling negativity, which could be related to increasing emotion regulation and mood disorders. So when we're making the DVD, we're going to have these 5 areas. So there'll be actually 6 DVDs. So the 6th one is just going to be a restorative practice. So we're working on that. Another thing I wanted to say too was another one of your handouts has that model, and it has all our contact information. So we're very accessible. So please feel free to call us if you have any ideas or thoughts, or just want to be part of the movement. This is, the yoga became so popular in the institution, there were certain youths that were granted off grounds permission. So at that time, I got permission to take the youth to, this is Edgewater Park at the beach. So we did sunrise yoga. So we got there at like 5 in the morning, watched the sunrise. We did some different retreats. The maintenance staff came and taught the youth how to fish. And one of the officers did hiking, so spending time in nature. So we were really lucky that we had that opportunity. And just to say too, the officers have benefited from the yoga so much as well. Within the institution, during staff appreciation, we did regular yoga classes. These youth also did community service. So for example, at that time, they were going to a nursing home. So I actually went with them and we co-taught a yoga class with the nursing home youth. So again, with the limited, abilities, we had some, people that maybe they had a stroke, so they couldn't use one arm, but they just used one arm to do some of the poses. And both the youth and the residents just got so much benefit out of it. So there's just a lot of creative ways to incorporate yoga within a juvenile facility. And this is just another one. This is at Edgewater Park, just a picture. And we also linked up with a local organization called Drink Local, Drink Tap. They did community beach cleanup. So we actually helped them clean up the beach, and we recorded Drink Local, Drink Tap. They record the things, the garbage that they collect, and they report that to the Great Lakes Authority, looking at clean water. So we did that as well. I'm actually going to turn it over to Chris to talk about, Chris, if you could talk about your experience with the program, any benefits you saw.
As I mentioned, I was actually involved in my yoga teacher training at the time. I approached Lynn to volunteer. First of all, it was experiences for my program, from my teaching program. And I actually started with one of the social workers at the prison, and I think I worked with her maybe 1.5 years, and then Lynn transitioned to that woman moved up in the administration, and so when Lynn and I got together. But Lynn, I did go to see her her first class. That was my observation class, just to see what it was like. And one word Lynn said to me was, "You have to be flexible." So as I mentioned, I had been a long-time Cleveland art teacher, and I had worked with at-risk youth throughout that time, obviously. And so I think flexibility was one of the main attributes as a teacher in the Cleveland system. So that didn't seem so challenging to me. But I do want to paint a little picture of what I experienced there as a teacher. So at the time, I was also teaching in a yoga studio and at a church, and had eventually become teacher with the foster youth program in Cleveland. Very, very different kinds of settings. So at the prison, we were on paper supposed to have a 45-minute class. Of course, that didn't always happen. Sometimes I would be driving to the prison and I would get a text that, oh, the program's canceled today, Chris, because some other program had come up. So anyway, the times that we did have classes, I started out just on a unit teaching, and there would be loudspeakers, obviously, with messages for the kids. Was not in many ways like teaching in a yoga studio. The time varied, the number of kids in the class varied. You know, buzzers would go off, loudspeakers. There would be sometimes fire drills that happen. So, and I'm not saying that as it being such a negative thing. I just want to say that was an aspect of teaching there. And sometimes kids would be called out to go to appointments or whatever. So, so that was sort of the setting that yoga took place in. And so it always amazed me that the kids could actually get into the yoga despite all those disruptions at times. And, you know, so I worked or taught on the intake unit as Lynn mentioned, but also in the gym with kids who had already taken yoga. So the intake yoga, that was kids coming and going, you know, after 30 days who had just come to the prison. So you can imagine their anxiety just coming into that kind of setting and trying to find their way. And sometimes I'd have 30 kids in that class, sometimes 10, depending on how many kids were brought in. And, you know, I mean, I have to say, doing yoga sometimes is kind of weird. I mean, it can be, you know, I mean, as adults, I mean, personally speaking, I feel awkward in some poses sometimes. So you can imagine kids coming into that kind of setting and trying and being told that, oh, we're doing yoga. And I could hear the new kids saying, yoga, really? You know, and so there was a little bit of, you know, resistance, let's put it that way, mildly. But I have to say, to a person after participating one or two times, they always seem to get into it. So I taught 25 minutes or so of gentle yoga, depending on the time we had, and then another 15 to 20 of meditation. So often when I started that class, I would say, well, what do you guys want to do today? You want more yoga or you want more meditation? Of course, they always said more meditation because you know, I think they understood on some level that they needed it. And so, you know, you could see from the pictures, I mean, that guy, the one teacher, he could be a pretzel, but, you know, most of the kids, you know, teenagers in general, I don't think can move very well. You know, I was always surprised, you know, I'm retired, and sometimes kids would come up to me after class and say, how did you get so flexible? And I would always think, me flexible, even though I've been doing yoga for so long. But anyway, so we did the yoga. They did the best they could. They honestly, I mostly saw in good faith, they would try to do whatever the poses were that I called as best they could. But then after that, they'd settle down onto their mats. When I was on the intake unit, we didn't have blankets or blocks or supports or bolsters, or, well, I think we did have blocks at some points, but just mostly the mats. And so after our yoga portion, they would lay down and almost to a person would calm down. I could see it in their faces. I've mentioned this many times to other people. So I would walk around as I was doing the cues for meditation, and it was sort of based on yoga nidra, loosely based on yoga nidra, which is kind of a meditation practice in yoga, a specialized one. And I could see on their faces, excuse me, as I walked around, this calmness in their faces, and I have to say, an innocence. And of course, that innocence is there all the time. It's just that they're bombarded so much, well, probably throughout their whole lives with stress and trauma and everything else. but for that brief period of time on those days, I could see them physically calming down, almost to a person, and relaxing. And when you think about it, relaxing in a setting with 30 other kids around, we did the yoga on the intake unit between bunk beds. So the kids would line their mats up between their rows of bunk beds. And, you know, I don't know, for me, it gave me a purpose. I mentioned I was going through some really difficult personal times when I first started there. Actually, my husband had just died a few months before. And so I was dealing with that grief. And sometimes I have to say, I would pray on my way to the prison to please help me through that class. Not that I was scared or threatened or anything whatsoever like that, but just to give me the personal strength to teach and be there for those kids. And for me, I don't want to talk about so much about myself, but there were so many personal rewards for me in that after the classes, many kids from time to time would come up and say, thank you. Thank you for teaching. I needed that. They said some other stuff too, but you know, they were so grateful to have those few moments of peace. And, you know, it wasn't every time, it wasn't every kid. I mean, in all honesty, we once had a fight break out during yoga. So there were, it was a prison setting, so it was not so neat and orderly all the time, but I feel over those 3 years that I witnessed and watched the kids and got to know some of the kids, that it was so beneficial to them, mainly through their own anecdotes that they came and told me about. And Lynn has told me since we, left, that she has run into kids, even around Cleveland or whatever, who have told her that they miss yoga. Or I had kids coming up to me after our daily program and saying, oh, when I get out, I'm going to continue yoga. Where can I do this? Or something like that. So I know, it's not official research so much as far as what I witnessed, but from their own responses, even just that physical response of letting go for 10 or 15 minutes during that meditation portion, I know that it was effective. And so, I hope, the one thing I have to say is, in a prison setting, I got to know some kids I know took from that first class that I taught 3 years ago to when the classes ended. Sometimes kids would come and go because their sentence would be over, and I often didn't get to say goodbye to the kids. But I still think of them and still hope that somehow, after they had been released, that they remember the breath work that they learned throughout, which is more important probably than anything, and that they, for those few moments, could find that peace. So anyway, I think it was rewarding for them and for me as well as a teacher. And that, isn't that what teaching is about, really? So anyway.
Thank you, Chris. So that concludes my portion, and I'm going to turn it over to Katherine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Kelton. And so really largely what I'll be sharing today is some of the theoretical background for why we believe yoga would be helpful for individuals who are struggling with various mental health diagnoses, but particularly in the context of, in the case of juveniles detention and for adults incarceration. So I'm going to be sharing a bit of theory, and then I'd also like to circle back to some of the elements of cultural humility and some of the gaps that Lynn has touched on in terms of where we are with a couple of different items with respect to that. All right, so one of the most important things I think to recognize, and Lynn has touched on this earlier, is that there's high rates of trauma exposure and post-traumatic stress disorder for people involved in the legal system. That goes from juveniles all the way ranging to adults. A lot of the literature I am familiar with pulls from women, adult women who are involved in the legal system. And so we know that in terms of adult women who've been involved in the legal system, they have incredibly high rates of childhood trauma. So when we look at adverse childhood experiences through the ACEs survey, which is a 10-item questionnaire that just discusses various trauma exposure experiences for youth, under the age of 18, general folks in the population can have between 1 to 2 ACEs or childhood traumatic experiences, while women who are adult and incarcerated have reported on average between 3 to 6. So we're seeing quite a higher rate. And the other piece is that trauma is often a pathway to incarceration. There are several studies that have interviewed folks who are adults and are incarcerated, and they describe a lot of their beginning of involvement in what we would kind of in the broader field of psychology just think of as criminally deviant behavior is really impacted them, and that trauma often leads to their beginning and involvement in that behavior from a very young age. And what we see here is actually it's a lot less about criminal behavior and many times strategies of survival and some really protective behaviors people can engage in that from an outside perspective look inappropriate or are inconcordant with the law. So for example, I was working with a young individual as part of a diversion program in the Circuit Attorney's Office of St. Louis, Missouri. And this individual would run stop signs. And in the context of their neighborhood, that was protective because if you were to stop at a stop sign, there would be a higher likelihood of being carjacked or being robbed or being involved in some sort of community-based violence. And so it's really about context switching, and that, again, in the broader sense of the law, that is considered to be reckless behavior. And what we know is that these youth oftentimes are really adapting to their environment, but that sort of trauma and avoidance of that trauma exposure or post-traumatic stress reaction can often lead to people's involvement in the legal system. I think we also need to recognize that incarceration or detention is a potentially traumatic experience. You think about strip searches that happen, and a lot of these individuals have experienced sexual violation, sexual abuse, all the way from childhood. You think about having people come in and check for contraband. So that lack of safety and sense of security within one's personal space. And I think it's incredibly important for us to talk about race-based traumatic stress, intergenerational trauma as a part of this picture. As Lynn talked about, there is overrepresentation in our legal system, ranging from juveniles all the way through adults, of folks who identify as African-American, Black, Hispanic, Latinx. And this starts from just over-policing in Black and brown communities. So the issues are much more systemic and not just limited to the criminal legal system, but we definitely start to see those disparities showing up there. But what I want to talk about is that, and kind of leading towards this line of yoga as an area for intervention, is that we know that trauma impacts self-regulation. And when I'm talking about self-regulation, I'm talking about one's ability to modulate their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in service of a goal. And oftentimes when we're talking about folks in the criminal legal system, we're talking about trying not to have further involvement with the legal system. And so one of the ways that trauma impacts self-regulation is, as Lynn demonstrated, through the brain. So we have changes to the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, which are all really key for executive functioning. And so the other pathway is through behavior. So things like social learning. When folks are growing up where there's community violence or chaotic home environments, they are starting to learn to have their needs met in ways in which might look very different, and again, in accordance with the law. There's also, again, modeling of poor emotion regulation, or again, just a different framework for how one gets their needs met. And I'll give you the example. So again, working in the city circuit attorney's office, I worked with young individuals, and when they would go in front of the judge and hear disappointing news about, say, a home plan not being approved, they would often speak back to the judge in a way that, from the court's perspective, was only going to get them in more trouble. But what we start to understand is that when kids are coming from an environment that is highly invalidating or violent, the way they've gotten their needs met historically is through raising their voice, is through yelling or making arguments. And I think that it's a lot about code switching, honestly, and context switching that is important. And so one of the ways, again, that we see trauma impacting self-regulation is impulsivity, aggression, difficulty problem solving, and difficulty with complex goals. So one of the important things to recognize about yoga is that there are studies that demonstrate yoga has improvement in areas of the brain that are impacted by trauma. And so from a behavioral perspective, also you think of yoga as a self-regulatory skill. So what I mean by that is when you have an individual begin to focus on their bodily perceptions and sensations, which are key in the initial trauma response. So we're talking about fight or flight or freeze. They begin to form a gentle and non-demanding relationship with their body. So they have an increased bodily awareness. An increased bodily awareness helps individuals begin to identify trauma-triggered emotional responses and begin to match their body's sensations to emotions, particularly those that can become activated when someone is having a traumatic stress response. And then from there, yoga is able to help folks begin to have skills to manage those emotional states. So one of the things that I'll kind of illustrate is, for example, say that you are holding a plank. So that's where you have your hands out in front of you and your legs behind you, kind of like a board, like a plank, hence the name. And so you might have all kinds of thoughts happening as you get into this plank, that this is hard, this is really difficult, this hurts, this sucks. And you might have then the urge to come out of this pose or to curse at your teacher, right? And one of the things that yoga instructors do in a very cognitive behavioral fashion is they start to link and have people notice what types of thoughts and feelings are coming up for them as they are holding these physical postures. So then in that way, yoga can become a sort of embodied cognitive behavioral therapy. And so one of the things that I wanted to share with folks is to talk a bit about my dissertation as an example of kind of yoga as a self-regulatory tool. So I'm going to just briefly go over the qualitative portion of my dissertation to illustrate the ways in which yoga can be perceived by participants as helpful in achieving just kind of their individual behavioral goals. So I did a randomized controlled trial at the Fulton Community Supervision Center in Fulton, Missouri, in partnership with the Prison Yoga Project. And this is a technical violator program, which is a 120-day program for women who have in some way violated probation or parole. And instead of sending them back to prison, this is a residential center behind a probation and parole office that really focuses on substance use and trauma therapy and educational and vocational training. It pulls from 55 rural counties and is meant for folks who are high risk for recidivism. So we had a total of 58 participants. Again, they're older in age. They did range down more into that emerging adult range with beginning at age 19. A lot of folks were, again, emerging adults and then into younger adulthood. And so we had a lot of folks who were identified as mothers and lower educational attainment. Again, this is just a little bit of information and kind of demographics about some of the legal concerns that folks had. We did, again, try to do some retrospective analysis of just kind of criminal legal involvement from youth. So a lot of folks had actually a higher age of their first arrest than maybe some of the folks that Lynn and other people are describing in their work. But what we find here in terms of childhood trauma, which is why I discussed this earlier, is a lot of people in our sample experienced some sort of adverse childhood event, and particularly a high percentage experienced something that was interpersonal in nature, so some sort of violation. It is really important to remember, though, that those original 10 ACEs questionnaires don't capture some of the other types of experiences that people in marginalized and oppressed communities might experience. So I'm talking about food insecurity, financial issues, and homelessness. So we did expand to one of the newer models of the ACEs questionnaire to try to capture some of that. So I did want to just kind of display this. And then in terms of adults, potentially traumatic events, there's also a high exposure rate. So one of the things that we know is often that when people experience one traumatic event, they are more likely over the course of their lifetime to experience more traumatic events. So the procedure was that essentially we did a randomized control trial. We lost a lot of data due to COVID and a scabies outbreak at one point. But what we're going to focus on today is those who completed yoga within this facility. So we had folks engage in 90 minutes of yoga twice a week for 6 weeks. And again, the pieces that we're going to focus on are the qualitative portions and then subjective measures of stress. So at weeks 1, 3, and 6, they completed the visual analog scale, also as a measurement of intervention fidelity. So what we'll see here is averages across weeks 1. So the VAS, weeks 1 through 6. So the VAS is a measure of subjective stress where participants indicate before and after yoga, just on a scale of 0 to 100, how much they are experiencing stress. And 0 is not at all, and 100 is like, this is the most stressful day of my life. And so what we can see here is that people's perceptions of their levels of stress after yoga decreased significantly in every class. So we are able to say that yoga is efficacious for people's perceptions of stress. Now, when it came to qualitative interviews, we start to see themes of self-regulation in here. And particularly within the context of the legal system, it's really important to understand if there are other programs going on how that might impact data. So because this facility also focused on trauma and substance use treatment, we did have folks express that in comparison to trauma-focused treatment, yoga was less stressful, right? And was a way to help people unwind after engaging in other difficult programming. In terms of self-regulation, we have response inhibition. So that's the ability to just control your attention, behavior, thoughts, or emotions. to kind of override any internal urges that you might have in order to live in line with your values or in service of a goal. So what we found here as an example is participants are able to say that I can slow down and think through what's going on. I think about the bigger picture and not react so much on impulse. So it's kind of that idea of responding instead of reacting. And people taking an introspective look at, when I am feeling upset, I'm trying to figure out what's the root issue and the cause of this. What we know, especially around trauma responses in people in the legal system, is that often anger is a secondary emotion. What often underlies anger is something like sadness or fear or worry. And it feels safer for anger to be the expressed emotion. So anger comes up and covers any sort of other emotion. So it's really an important skill for folks to stop and say, what's really happening for me? Anger seems to be the thing that's showing up perhaps in my behavior, but what's underlying that? Oftentimes there's other emotions going on. In terms of interoception, what we're talking about here is just a general sense of body awareness. So understanding the ways in which bodily perceptions and sensations are tied to emotional states. And so people here express from these exemplars that they're starting to understand how their day is reflected in their body, so the ways in which stress impacts the body, and then vice versa. If I'm feeling, something, some sort of stress, let me think back to what's going on in terms of my body and tune into what's happening there. In terms of acceptance, a lot of times what we see is a high level of avoidance with folks who have diagnoses of PTSD or have had some sort of trauma exposure. So really trying to avoid and cut out things in their life that remind them of whatever their traumatic experience is, whether that that is something out in their environment, so like situations, people, places, or things, or thoughts or feelings that occurred at the time of the traumatic event. So one of the things that yoga seems to help folks with is to accept their sensations for what they are, not labeling them as good or bad or as something I need to move away from, but something to be curious about and explore deeper. In terms of decentering, this is an explicit awareness of, consciousness as an understanding of your internal state as separate from oneself. So it's kind of being able, again, to see that larger picture and understanding that whatever your thoughts are doesn't necessarily equate to reality. So we had a participant describe a really just insightful experience where they had a trauma-related nightmare, and then they were able to wake up and their bed was kind of the same size as a yoga mat. And so they were able to say, put my hand on the wall, remember that I was in bed and that whatever I was thinking was not necessarily real. And so this is a direct relationship to folks thinking back to yoga. That was really, again, insightful. In terms of reappraisal, again, this is often a skill taught in cognitive behavioral therapy. So trying to think about a situation or a problem differently or attempting to take a new perspective of circumstances. So a lot of times, again, people have a lack of flexibility and kind of see things one way. And that with yoga, you're able to understand and kind of focus on yourself and what's happening and reframe your experience. So again, if you're holding that plank and saying, this really sucks, yoga might teach you to say, this is really challenging, and then lead you to have less of a desire to disengage from what you're doing. And then kind of just all around, I think that it's really important to discuss the intersection of trauma, PTSD, and then substance use. So this is just an exemplar from a participant who was able to talk about their yoga practice is helpful in tolerating urges or sensations for substance use. And there is a large literature base to support this. And so these are just my references. I'll stop sharing my screen now. But one of the things that I wanted to circle back to very briefly is, we're talking about all of this within the context of the legal system. And I think one of the most important things, again, that Lynn has touched on that I'd like to also discuss is that there are gaps, not only within the legal system and disparities in terms of race and ethnicity, but also the work that we're doing as yoga practitioners and yoga researchers within this system. And what I mean by that is there is a stark lack of representation of diversity among yoga instructors who go into these facilities, which is particularly important when we think about social learning and these kids' development. To have representation of someone who looks like them to be a yoga instructor is very important because, as Lynn said, people have perceptions of yoga, and the last thing that we want to do is start to reify yoga as a white person's experience or tool. And so what becomes really crucial is that we start to examine the intentions of yoga practitioners and yoga research and going into these facilities. It is very easy to slip into white centering and white saviorism when yoga instructors are going into this place to do yoga. And a lot of this also comes from a place of privilege. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of funding behind yoga by institutions. And so oftentimes these things are volunteer based. And so because systems are so far away generally from cities, you have to have volunteers with transportation, time on their hands, and the money to do so, to be able to travel out to these facilities to deliver a service for free. And so what that does is it reinforces some of the institutional inequities that we're seeing, and especially when it comes to representation of diversity within yoga instructors. So what is really important for this research moving forward is that there's a collaboration between institutions to see this as a service that's being delivered, and then recruitment that reflects the representation of the population with this, who's being designed with this design in mind. And I say that because if you look at some of the images from our presentation, you look at most of us who are on the call, we're all white presenting, and that's problematic. And so one of the things that's going to be incredibly important for the legal system in general, but also this yoga research moving forward, is an integration and representation and a real intention to think about race and ethnicity a priori versus ad post hoc. And so I say that all just to kind of wrap everything together that other folks have been talking about. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz Goncy.
All right, so I am going to present some of the evaluation that we, as part of our partnership with Lynn at the correctional facility, some of the evaluation of the prison yoga project with juveniles from this grant that had been given to Lynn, and and to be able to evaluate some of what's happening. So I'm with Cleveland State University, and I'm part of the Thrive Research Collaborative. And so we work in collaboration with community agencies and other things in Northeast Ohio to kind of help support the work that they're doing to help promote positive youth well-being and resiliency. And so we were thrilled to make this connection with Lynn and to be able to provide some analysis on the research side of things to just sort of show a little bit of what was happening. So I'm going to just briefly overview a little bit of things and then present some findings, and then also talk about another study that relates to how we're implementing yoga in the Cleveland area within our school district. So just to give a little bit of background, I know Lynn did a really nice job of describing all the different types of yoga and that have been going on for a very long time. I do want to mention that we were only evaluating the prison yoga project and the yoga during one year. And so because of this, and it was a research study, there are some limitations, and we can talk about those, but some of the biggest issues here that we saw is that we had to have sort of a controlled place where we could only invite youth that were in 2 housing units at the time to participate. So that sort of limited. We weren't having groups of 30 necessarily involved in the research study. However, other individuals were able to participate. They just weren't always had the consent or the assent to be able to do the research. So 20 male youth agreed to participate, and they completed pre-assessment measures. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of their age, they averaged about 18, and the range was from 16 to 19 years. And they were primarily housed for person crimes, things like robbery, assault, etc. The timeline of kind of how this worked out is that we did and had planned to do the pre-assessment in October of 2019, and then twice weekly yoga sessions running from October 19 to May 20, and then doing a post-assessment May 20. As we all know, COVID kind of jumped into the game here, and so we were unable to actually do our post-assessment. Obviously, volunteers were not allowed in the facility anymore once COVID started, and so that stopped the yoga program. Even if we had wanted to go in and to do our post-assessment, I think there might have been some issues in terms of the results of that data, and making sure that we were clear in that this was a change related to yoga and not COVID, because we might have actually seen reversals or decreases in improvements. So let me talk a little bit about the pre-assessment and what we asked these youth to do. And so we had a few graduate students who went in and helped out collecting this data one-on-one with participants, sometimes reading, sometimes helping them with it. And so we gave them a variety of measures and asked them just to give us a little bit of a sense of where they were starting with. So one of these measures was the adolescent cope measure. It's a measure of coping strategies. And as you can see here, across a number of these strategies, they're reporting that they're using a variety of these strategies a lot of the time. So that on that 1 to 5 scale, about in the middle. We do see a few that were used a little less frequently, like social support, seeking professional help. But on average, you see that most of the strategies, they're reporting using, or at least being aware of. It's unclear how much they were actually using some of these strategies. We also did a measure of trauma just to kind of better understand and assess what these youth were coming in with. So as Lynn talked about, and also as Katherine has mentioned, with history of adverse childhood experiences, the mounting evidence of lots of trauma being compounded across multiple places, as well as being in a very traumatic setting, because prisons are not, as we've heard discussed here, an easy setting for youth to sort of engage in. We use the trauma PTSD checklist, the civilian version, which just basically assesses symptoms related to generic stressful experiences. And it assumes that multiple traumas are possible. And just to give you sort of a sense of where this sample looked at, the cut point for a specialized medical clinic falls somewhere between the 36 to 44 point range, and a specialized mental health clinic is the 45 to 50 range. The sample mean here was almost 40, meaning that a lot of these youth were already kind of at an elevated level. And more specifically, we're seeing that about 45% of them were above the cut point, so higher than a 45 for specialized mental health clinics. So this is a highly traumatic, a sample that has experienced high levels of trauma and are also experiencing symptoms of trauma-related distress as well. So let's talk a little bit about yoga and how this was implemented in the evaluation component of this. So obviously using the FLAME protocol that Lynn so nicely outlined earlier, that was implemented in 1 hour sessions. And as Chris mentioned earlier, sometimes they weren't always 1 hour, sometimes they would be less, there would be things that kind of got in the way. 2 times a week, there was 5 registered yoga teachers, and a little bit about their training background was that they had 200 hours for registered yoga training school through the Yoga Alliance, and also had completed trauma training with the Prison Yoga Project, so that they were able to sort of implement this trauma-informed lens in their yoga instruction. We actually were able to get 70% of the youth who did the pre-assessment to participate in yoga, and some of this was some complicating factors. We had to get parental consent for those who were under 18. So trying to, reach parents or a guardian. By that time, some youth maybe changed their mind or had been released. So at the end of the day, 14 of these youth actually participated. And we ran a little bit of analyses just to kind of understand if there was anything systematic about those who participated versus those who didn't actually do the yoga. And we actually saw no differences across things like coping, self-regulation. We did a behavioral assessment using the BASC-3, any of the PTSD symptoms. There was actually no differences. You can see that on average, participants did about 30 sessions. And we had one youth, I know for sure, had only done 19 because he was released. But we had, most of the youth doing at least 30 sessions. As Katherine so nicely described earlier, here's the visual analog scale that we actually, in a visual representation and a literal picture of what was given to the youth. At the beginning of the session, we asked them to mark an X to indicate their level of stress. And then at the end of the session, we asked them to mark an O to indicate their post-session stress level. And this allowed us the ability to then calculate by millimeter how much their stress level was. And then we created percentile or proportion to look at the change in stress from beginning to end. So on average, we saw across all sessions and all participants, a 38% reduction in stress from pre-yoga to post-yoga. And that this average actually ranged a little bit for certain individuals. So we had one individual who on average only saw about a 9% decrease in stress, so a smaller amount, where we had some that were indicating a much larger. So the largest range was about 62% change in stress from beginning to end. So that kind of gives you a sense of on average that we're seeing some really good improvements. And I think this sort of models some of the data that we also saw with Katherine in her project about how much was actually, improvements that we're seeing in stress. But it wasn't always an improvement in stress. So I do want to sort of indicate here that 9% of the time across participants, they actually indicated worsened stress. And so sometimes when you're dealing with some of those stressful moments, those instances where you're really maybe feeling that plank is really difficult, or you're also thinking of a challenging situation and you're having that moment to self-reflect, that might actually increase your stress level, particularly if you're thinking about not having instances where this can happen. So I'm not actually surprised that in some instances we saw some worsened stress. It could be frustrating, particularly for youth who are maybe not used to doing things like this. But I think what is really important is that almost 60% of the time, we were seeing at least a 20% improvement or greater. This 38% of 50 to 90% improvement in stress. I think that's pretty remarkable that we're seeing such a large thing there that's happening. Across time, I actually wanted to just show a little bit of a slide here of how this change in stress level on average went from the beginning of the sessions to the end of the sessions. And you can see here at the beginning, we're a little bit over a 30% increase, and towards the end, we're over the 40% increase. And there were a few little valleys here that I think caused me to pause for a moment and think. And I think Chris eloquently explained some of those complexities. Maybe it was a fire drill or a fight broke out during yoga. And unfortunately, we don't have notes to sort of qualify what happened during these circumstances. But one thing that did stand out to me is this dip from session 21 and session 22. And I actually went back and looked at the dates, and this is the 2 dates that happened after they had a break for the holidays. So I think there had been a week or 2 where they were off around Christmas and New Year's. And these were the first 2 sessions in January. So you could imagine that maybe stress had been different. This may have been the first time some of these youth had maybe been away from family. There may have been other things that were happening. And so if I actually take those 2 data points out, we actually see that trend line, the dotted line, actually increases to closer to 50% by the end. So if we just remove those 2 data points as somewhat outliers, I think that's kind of notable to consider. So we also had the ability to look at self-regulation at the pre-assessment, and we were able to sort of compare that self-regulation, this ability to think about behavior, cognitions, emotions, and how they reflect your behavior in both 2 ways that we looked at this. We had a short-term and a long-term self-regulation skill that youth completed at the pre-assessment. And I looked at the self-regulation and sort of looked at whether any of that was related to their changes in stress related to yoga. And what we actually saw is for those who had higher long-term self-regulation skills, so the ability to sort of regulate their emotions, their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors at a higher rate or more skilled at that, were the ones who we actually saw a higher change in average stress. And so this correlation, it's rather large at 0.5. And although it didn't quite reach statistical significance, that magical P less than 0.05, I think with a small sample like this, it's still clinically meaningful in a way to think about teaching some of those early self-regulation skills, how that might then enhance the benefits of doing something like yoga. So in general, the conclusions that I want to say is that across 82% of the sessions, youth reported at least an improvement in stress levels of 10%. And in only 9% did they actually see that yoga worsened their stress. And I think what's really nice is that the combination of yoga within a trauma-informed lens was critical in these places. So in incorporating that trauma-focused idea and thinking about how we can create an environment that would be safe and nurturing to do yoga in a rather stressful situation, particularly for those who are maybe less so inclined to thinking about doing yoga prior to the Prison Yoga Project. So we see that yoga might be beneficial in stressful environments, and that they might be able, we know from prior research, as well as particularly the sample, that imprisoned youth are likely to experience higher stress. And yoga may be one of those mechanisms that can help improve stress levels, at least in the short term. So maybe if it's that 1 hour, but we're also seeing that, you know, the ability to improve stress levels increases with practice. Like LeBron James said at the beginning, you know, you have to work that muscle and you have to be able to enhance those skills and practice them in order for it to become stronger. We also think that yoga might be a way to help improve self-regulation skills. But this study, or at least, you know, at a small level here, is showing that some evidence that these skills are necessary to have before, you know, yoga might have even bigger advantages. So one of the implications that I think here is that we really should be focusing on teaching self-regulation skills earlier. So we do see that deficits in self-regulation are things that we might have difficulty in focusing, aggressive behavior, poor communication, poor coping skills, difficulties labeling your emotions. All of those things kind of fall under the wheelhouse of self-regulation. So, you know, thinking about behavior, emotions, thoughts, all of those things together. And there is some research, particularly in childhood and adolescence, that stronger self-regulation skills are actually going to improve adaptive functioning outcomes. So kids who have good self-regulation skills, there's plenty of evidence to suggest higher academic performance, better social competence, higher stress management, et cetera. So I think one way that we're starting to see some of this is how can we teach self-regulation skills, and then how can we enhance those self-regulation skills early? So one project that our Thrive collaborative team has also been involved in is looking at school-based mindful yoga. They actually, you know, schools are, you know, someplace that we see lots of kids, right? So it's an advantageous setting to start program implementation. Implementation in schools actually takes away many of those barriers because now you're allowing yoga to be accessible to all kids based on intelligence, age, gender, SES. Assuming kids are attending school, right? I mean, I think that's an assumption that we need to make when we're sort of assuming a school-based mindful yoga program can happen. So I think one way that we've done this is, and we've actually evaluated a little bit of this, is in partnership with a nonprofit school-based yoga and mindfulness program called ZenWorks Yoga. And they have been providing yoga in the Cleveland school districts for several years to provide an intervention at no or low cost to these schools. And they do it through trained yoga instructors talking students through mindful yoga poses on a video that can be, you know, done in a school setting. The teacher can do it right then and there. They're, you know, push the desks aside. And I want to present a little bit of data from the 2018-2019 school year in which a 20-week yoga and mindfulness curriculum had been implemented in our Cleveland public schools across, I think, 8 or 9 different schools, and sort of some of the results or interesting things that kind of came out of this. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of who these youth are, we had almost 1,000 youth that participated between the ages of 7 and 15 from 10 Cleveland area school districts. 44% of these youth are African American, another 28% are Hispanic, Latinx, 20% white, and then 8% other. And in this case, we only have binary data for gender, but it was evenly divided by male and female. And so what we actually saw is the pre-yoga to post-yoga changes, so similar to what I just presented on in the correctional facility. We did see some pre-yoga to post-yoga changes. So they did a pre-assessment, the 20-week program, and then asked about changes that paralleled things that had happened in the pre-assessment. And we actually saw statistically significant improvements in things like working better with teammates or other students, being happier where I live, increases in being able to focus or pay better attention during activities, and being able to calm down when I'm upset. But I think one of the most notable things about this is that kids must also enjoy yoga. So the kids who reported participating in yoga was actually fun and enjoyable, they're the ones we saw the biggest improvements in self-regulation. So I think this buy-in with children and youth and adolescents and incarcerated youth, you have to get them to want to be there and to want to do this. And I think this speaks to some of what Katherine mentioned at the end of her presentation, is talking a little bit about the accessibility and the social learning. You want to have yoga instructors, you want to have teachers, you want to have models that look like you and are doing this and make you feel comfortable in doing this and make it an enjoyable experience, because those were the kids that we actually saw the greatest improvements with. So I think a few future directions here is to consider mindfulness-based interventions or yoga-based interventions. So we focused a lot on, incarcerated individuals at this point, but I think this is something many psychologists can bring to their own practices, or at least finding ways to incorporate or think about using yoga as an enhancement to ongoing therapies. It might be particularly useful for kids who are struggling with self-regulation to help teach these skills. So sometimes that taking a step back, breathing before you act can really then allow some of the skills that we're teaching in other areas in social emotional behavior kind of improve. And then I also think that another takeaway here is to make the interventions fun, relatable, and consistent. So this can't be just a one-off, I'm going to teach yoga and you're going to do this and you're going to have this forever. But like any good practice, to become a great basketball player, you keep practicing. Same thing. If you want to be able to have these skills, you need to make sure that you're practicing them and doing them in a consistent manner. So that's where I am now. I also just want to thank the research collaborators on this who aren't here this morning. Shereen Naser, who's a school psychologist and has worked closely with ZenWorks. Kim Fuller, who is a certified sex therapist, as well as a social worker who has done a lot of work with us on this project, and Katherine Clonan-Roy, who is a curriculum and foundations instructor. So they're all PhD assistant professors at Cleveland State. And we had 2 graduate students, Kyle Eyman, who is using some of this for his master's thesis, as well as Jennifer Isaac, who's doing some of the ZenWorks data for her master's thesis. So I think what's really nice is that we're also training future psychologists and future researchers now on how to implement these and think about these in a larger, much more accessible way as we sort of move forward.
I just want to thank everyone, and it's been just such a pleasure. And please, if you're interested in collaborating or talking with us, we welcome your feedback. And thank you to my co-presenters. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you to all of our presenters for sharing your time and knowledge with us. Do you have a question you would like to ask the presenters? No problem. As part of OPA's 2021 convention, Individual, live, virtual Q&A sessions have been scheduled for each workshop. All you need to do is mark your calendars and plan to join us virtually on the morning of Friday, April 23rd, 2021, from 8 to 8:45 a.m. The Q&A session will be recorded and available for those who opt to view this webinar after April 2021. To receive credit for this webinar, please reference the document you received when you purchased this session. Use the links in the document to complete both the online webinar quiz and the evaluation form to receive credit. Credit will only be given if a score of 80% or higher is achieved on the quiz. Should you have any questions regarding today's educational program or the CE process, please call the OPA office at 614-224-0034. Thank you again to our presenters and to our attendees for choosing OPA to meet your continuing education needs. This concludes today's education program.